I've been playing Augmentation Evoker in Mythic Plus since its release, and in this video I want to take a look at these upcoming nerfs to the spec and give my thoughts on the future of Augmentation Evoker in general, because it's a super interesting spec, but I think because of how unique and different it is compared to any other spec in the game, there are going to be some challenges for Blizzard to keep this spec in a good spot. First off, it would be pretty hard to make a case that Augmentation Evoker didn't need some kind of a nerf. At the time I'm recording this, there's an Augmentation Evoker in every single one of the top 100 timed runs on Raider.io, and speaking from experience too, I hopped on an Evoker that essentially hadn't been touched since Season 1 of Dragonflight, and was almost immediately getting invites to pugs in the 20s and timing them, not feeling like I was getting carried at all. It started to become pretty clear to me as I pugged my way too high, way too quickly, that this probably wasn't going to last. And while I've been enjoying myself and wanting to continue playing the spec, I was definitely expecting some sort of nerf coming the way for Augmentation. The other thing that made pushing his Augmentation feel a little bit too good to be true is honestly the spec's difficulty, or lack thereof. You're filling a DPS spot. It doesn't really matter what kind of DPS you do, or a lot of times even what you're doing it to, just that you're keeping your buffs up on the other DPS, which is honestly pretty easy to do. I have a guide linked in the description if you want to learn more about it. At least for me, it felt like I could just sort of hop on this brand new spec, learn a pretty basic rotation, and succeed even though my gear was behind and I didn't really feel like I was particularly good at it. As long as I could maintain my buffs and make some kind of use of my utility, I was okay. There was definitely no doubt nerfs were coming Augmentation's way, so let's take a look at what we're dealing with here. So here are the patch notes, starting with the developer's note. They said Augmentation is overperforming in dungeons and is doing less direct damage than intended relative to the power of their buffing effects. These adjustments will increase their personal damage in all situations and moderately reduce the effectiveness of their buffs in dungeon content. We're going to get a little bit more into the way they chose to balance out Augmentation in a little bit. But to get started, first thing, closest clutch mates now causes Ebon Might and Breath of Eons to be 20% more effective when not in raid. It was 40%. So clearly we're targeting Mythic Plus here, as this is one of those passive talents similar to what Disc Priest gets, where your buff is more effective in 5-mans than in raid. And 20% is a pretty notable hit, and this is the meat of the nerf. All things considered, I think this is a pretty reasonable nerf to Augmentation, because there's no doubt that they are overperforming, and there are some compensatory buffs here, although they definitely don't make up the ground that you're going to be losing with your closest clutch mates buff. Next bullet point, fixed a bug where closest clutch mates would not increase the Evoker's damage done via Ebon Might for periodic effects such as Fire Breath, so just a small quality of life buff here to your own DPS is Augmentation. Ebon Might now increases the Evoker's damage done by 20%, up from 10, so again, it's a moderate buff to your own personal DPS. Eruption increased by 40%, so this is probably the best thing Augmentation is getting. Eruption represents a pretty healthy portion of your overall damage in a key, and this is not an insignificant buff, so it's not going to make up for the 20% hit to closest clutch mates, but it is intended to be a nerf after all, so it's nice that we're getting something in return. Fate's Mirror chance to occur is reduced to 15% from 20. It's a small nerf to the capstone talent that causes players with prescience to have a chance to echo damage or healing of an ability. And then Aspect's Favor amplifies Black Attunement to 7% and 10% maximum health, down from 10 and 16%. I'm not surprised at this one. So when you hit Obsidian Scales, you were giving your group a 16% HP buff, which is pretty nuts, honestly, especially given that this has 2 charges. So I think 10% will still make it worth taking, but it's going to scale it back a little bit. So to summarize, basically the damage you're providing other players is being moderately nerfed and your personal damage is being slightly buffed. I think this is fine for this initial nerf, since it was obvious that Augmentation was quite far out of line. I wouldn't want to see the spec taken too far in this direction though. As a support spec, I actually like that your job is giving significant damage to other players rather than doing your own, and I think taking too much power away from the party and giving it back to the Augmentation Evoker would effectively be watering the spec down if it happened too much. When I look at a nerf, I always like to look at the intention or the direction of the nerf, and that would be my one caution about this nerfed Augmentation. Please don't water down the spec or take away the fact that it's a support spec The whole thing that makes the spec cool is the fact that you're buffing other people's damage rather than your own. I've heard it mentioned that maybe this would make the spec easier to balance, and I have to say, as a player of the game and not a game developer, I don't really give a crap about that. But I do think this nerf will probably do what I imagine it's intended to do, and that's keep augmentation viable and probably still quite good, but make it so people won't feel it's mandatory to have in their higher key runs. The personal DPS boost certainly won't make up for the damage loss and the buffs you provide others, but it will be interesting to see how the spec plays when his damage might actually be a little bit more important than simply a means to maintain buffs on your party. I definitely don't see this nerf causing augmentation to fall into obscurity, and I think other players will still enjoy the boost they get from playing with an Aug Evoker, even if it's not exactly what it used to be. So to get an idea of what this change might actually look like, I pulled up a Warcraft log for a really high Augmentation Evoker. This is Lizzie McGuire in a plus 30 Neltharis. So from this log, we can see that Ebon Might and Breath of Eons contributed a combined 47% of damage done overall in this run. So this is what you don't see in details when you look at your damage breakdown that is shown in Warcraft logs. This 47% represents the piece that's being nerfed by 20%. Eruption represents almost 7% of the damage done in this run, and that's being buffed by 40%. So pretty clearly not an even trade-off here, and keep in mind this is just one example run I dug up as a visual, not an end-all be-all math problem into the nerf, but it kind of helped me wrap my head around what's happening here. All in all though, I've enjoyed my time on Augmentation, and I do plan to keep playing it in the future post-nerf. I haven't had a single dungeon where anyone made any comments about my low DPS and details, and I'm loving the idea of supporting specs making their way into the game. I do worry a little bit about support specs and the fact that they might be taking away a spot from an already overcrowded pool of DPS players looking for spots in groups. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Blizzard tries to implement more support specs in the future if they decide to go that route. I could also see it as a place for possible reworks of some specs that have been sort of up in the air for years, can't seem to get any traction. Maybe they get reworked as support specs. Seems like it could be a pretty cool idea. So I don't know what you guys think as either augmentation players or people who likely group with them, which is a pretty hard thing to avoid right now. What do you think about these nerfs? Are they too much? Not enough? Do you like that they're putting some of augmentation's damage back into their own hands? Let me know in the comments, guys. And as always, if you made it this far, please thumb up the video, subscribe to see more of my content in the future. It helps me out a lot. You can also check out my stream here on YouTube Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 9 p.m. Pacific, where we play lots of healers as well as Augmentation Evoker, and we have a really cool community of players that are fun to hang out with. Love to see you sometime. Until next time, guys, happy healing and augmenting.